The countdown read 4 hours 12 minutes and 7 seconds when Fleet Commander Vresh first heard a human laugh. Not scream. Not beg. It crackled over the open comm channel from the surrendered mining colony on Siri Station, low and dry, from a woman named Dr. Elena Cho, chained to a chair, for Scorvith soldiers pointing plasma rifles at her skull. You have 4 hours to comply, the translator droned, or your species ends today. Elena tilted her head. 4 hours, she said. Plenty of time. Vresh didn't understand the joke yet. He would. In 4 hours he'd understand it better than any Scorvith in history. The Scorvith Dominion had conquered 11 species in 600 years, and every single one had followed the same script. First contact, demonstration of overwhelming force, ultimatum, surrender. It was efficient. It was clean. It had never failed. Humanity was supposed to be the 12th checkmark. The Scorvith were a hive-linked species, 3 billion minds tied into a single collective consciousness that made them nearly impossible to surprise, deceive, or demoralize. No individual Scorvith feared death, because death was just unplugging one node from an ocean of others. They didn't panic. They didn't grieve. They calculated. And by every calculation, humans were a joke. Fractured. Tribal. Contradictory. A species that spent its short, brutal lifespans arguing with itself about everything, politics, religion, which sports team was better, and somehow still building spacecraft in between. No hive mind. No unified command structure. Emotional to the point of self-sabotage. They fight each other more than they fight anyone else, Vresh's tactical officer, Threll, had reported during the initial survey. Their history is one long argument with brief pauses for tea. Vresh had found that reassuring. An enemy divided against itself is an enemy you don't have to work hard to beat. So when the Dominion fleet, 41 warships, more firepower than had subdued the Krellin Empire in a single afternoon, arrived in Sol's outer system, Vresh expected the usual pattern. Show strength. Demand surrender. Watch the primitive apes fold. He gave humanity 6 hours after taking Siri Station as a demonstration. He should have given them 6 minutes to notice what he'd actually done. The problem, and Vresh wouldn't understand this was a problem for another 3 hours and 40 minutes, was that the Scorvith collective didn't understand time the way humans did. To the hive mind, 6 hours was nothing. A rounding error. 3 billion minds could deliberate a decision across that span without any single node feeling the pressure, because the collective was eternal, patient, undying in aggregate. But humans didn't experience time as a collective. They experienced it as individuals, staring down a clock, each second a hammer blow, and somewhere in that species' bloody, argumentative history, they had learned to do something the Scorvith had never needed to learn. They had learned to move fast when it mattered. At the 2-hour mark, Scorvith sensor arrays picked up encrypted burst transmissions rippling out from Earth to Mars, to the Belt, to the shipyards at Europa, hundreds of them, overlapping, chaotic. Threll flagged it as likely panic. Infighting. Maybe factions arguing about whether to surrender at all. Let them argue, Vresh said. A house fighting itself doesn't need us to burn it down. He didn't know that human military doctrine had a name for what was actually happening. Auftragstaktik. Mission-type tactics. No central command dictating every move, just intent, communicated fast, and trusted to 1,000 independent commanders to execute in whatever insane, creative way they saw fit. The Scorvith collective could not do this. A single mind, unplugged from the whole, was not trusted to improvise. It waited for consensus. Humans didn't wait. Humans didn't need to agree with each other to fight for each other. At the 3-hour mark, something worse happened. Something the collective's threat models had never flagged as possible. Human ships started disappearing. Not destroyed. Disappearing. Freighters, salvage tugs, decommissioned military hulls, vanishing from every tracking grid the Scorvith had, one after another, like the entire Sol system was quietly emptying its garage. Cowardice, Threll offered. They're fleeing. Vresh watched the sensor ghosts blink out one by one and felt, for the first time in 600 years of conquest, something his collective had no clean word for. Uncertainty. At 3 hours 51 minutes, Dr. Elena Cho, still chained, still calm, for rifles still aimed at her head, looked directly into the nearest Scorvith optical sensor and said something that would end up quoted for the next 3 centuries of human history. You didn't ask why we're the only species that never had a golden age of peace before you people showed up. You should have asked. Vresh finally asked. The answer arrived 9 minutes later, and it arrived at 11 kilometers per second. Humanity's disappeared ships hadn't fled. They'd gone dark, gone silent, and gone exactly where 4,000 years of naval warfare had taught humans to put a fleet you don't want your enemy to see coming, behind the sun's gravity well, in the debris shadow of the asteroid belt, in the blind spots of a species that had never needed to develop stealth doctrine because their hive mind always assumed it already knew everything worth knowing. The Scorvith didn't do surprise. They didn't do deception between their own nodes, so they'd never built the instincts to expect it from an enemy. Humans had built their entire military history around exactly that instinct. And every single one of those ships, freighters retrofitted with mass-driver rail cannons, mining lasers repurposed into point defense grids, decommissioned warships running skeleton crews of volunteers who knew this might be a one-way mission, had spent those wasted 6 hours doing one thing: getting into position. At 5 hours 51 minutes, 9 minutes before the deadline, Earth's combined defense fleet, 312 vessels, a fraction of the Dominion's raw tonnage, dropped out of hiding in a synchronized burn that lit up every Scorvith sensor at once. Vresh's collective mind screamed a single unified thought across 3 billion linked nodes: recalculate. But recalculation took time, even for a hive mind. Consensus took cycles. And humans hadn't given them cycles. Human ships didn't wait for orders from a central authority. Captains who'd spent 4 hours reading the same one-page mission brief opened fire the instant they had a shot. No permission required, no vote needed, no hesitation while 3 billion minds argued about the optimal firing solution. The Scorvith flagship's shields buckled under 6 simultaneous mass driver strikes before its point defense grid even finished updating target priority. "They're not fighting like an army," Threll said, voice cracking with something the collective had never trained him to feel. "They're fighting like a swarm that hates each other and loves each other at the same time." Vresh watched his 41-ship fleet become 31, then 22, in the space of 11 minutes. Not because human ships were stronger, but because every human captain made a different, unpredictable, individually insane choice at the exact same moment, and the collective's single unified mind simply could not model 12,000 separate acts of stubborn, furious improvisation fast enough to counter them all. On Ceres Station, with the deadline long past and her captors distracted by a battle they were losing, Elena Cho slipped one hand from a restraint she'd been quietly working loose for 3 hours and 40 minutes, and reminded herself of something her drill instructor used to say. Humans don't need permission to refuse to die. The Dominion fleet broke formation at the 6-hour 9-minute mark. Not defeated. Not yet. But for the first time in 600 years, retreating. Vresh's last transmission before his flagship's collective link went dark for the final time was not a battle report. It was a question broadcast to the entire Dominion, 3 billion minds listening at once. What do you call a species that agrees on nothing and still shows up for each other anyway? Nobody in the collective had an answer. 300 light-years away, on a bridge full of exhausted, laughing, weeping humans who just watched an empire's fleet retreat from a system it had called doomed 6 hours earlier, someone finally gave one. "We call it Tuesday,"